Hey everyone, it's Jim
and Charles
from Valves and More, an online vintage tube store. And today, in Tube Lab number 186, we're going to take another look at vintage tubes for the much-loved Freya Plus preamp. But first, caution everyone, electronics and tube amplifiers can have very high voltages present, which can be lethal. Exercise extreme caution when working around them. Always consult a professional technician when in doubt. It's now been years since we first looked at the tubes we recommend for the Freya, and given the Freya is probably the best-selling preamp of all time, an update is long overdue.
Especially since the tubes that are available have changed dramatically in those years.
Yeah. Now, if you don't own a Freya, this episode will still be interesting because we're going to talk about not only the best-sounding vintage 6SN7s that are still available, but equivalents that you can use to totally change up your sound. Now, the Freya is a true balanced preamp, and what that means is you've got a positive phase and a negative phase that need to be amplified, and as a result, you have 4 tubes in the Freya, and you're going to have a pair of voltage gain tubes. Those are on the right-hand side, and a pair of cathode follower tubes. That's on the left-hand side. Now, the cathode follower is simply a final electrical stage in most preamps that allows for a low impedance output, and that just allows it to couple with virtually anything further into the system, such as an integrated stereo amplifier or a power amplifier. So one of the sort of the mainstays of sets that we made up over the years for the Freya was the really rock solid GE 6SN7 GTA and GTB. They're both very, very similar tubes. The only difference is the filament warm-up spec, and they just do everything really well. And for a long time, they were the cathode follower recommendation of choice. And unfortunately, even though a lot of Gs were made, they're starting to become a fairly rare tube these days, particularly the new old stock version. We're lucky to still have some inventory of them. This is a tube that guitar players have known about for a long time. Now, this is rebranded Stark, but in fact, this is an RCA tube.
Canadian-made RCA tube.
Yeah, and we did an episode a little while back, so you can look that up if you're interested in knowing all about the scuttlebutt. But there was a lot of manufacturers that shipped parts and built tubes under license. And anyways, this particular tube was assembled in Canada, probably with parts supplied by RCA out of the US, and it's almost identical to the US version. And these are these have a really rich, warm kind of a tone.
Yeah, especially in the mid-range, and people seem to really love them for that. Yeah,
and it's a pretty distinctive, big, ugly, flat black plate that's elevated. And there's, of all the 6SN7s that were made, the RCAs probably have the highest variant number of variations.
Yeah, just really small changes to the micas, to the getter holders, to the bases, just lots of little variations.
They had a very long production run. And I mean, I should talk a little bit about the sonics of the 6SN7 in general are warm and rich. Some tend towards a little bit more warmth, and some a little bit less with a little bit more detail. And the 6SN7 is a general purpose twin triode, and it's essentially the workhorse of an entire era of vacuum tubes.
Yep.
You would find 6SN7s virtually in every circuit.
From TVs to radar.
Yep. to you name it, imagine it. And you'd find 6SN7. Later on, the 12AU7, which is a miniature 9-pin close equivalent to the 6SN7, became the ubiquitous tube, just like the 6SN7, and basically took over the role of the larger octal tube.
In a much smaller bottle.
Yeah, and that was simply a result of the introduction of TVs in the 1950s, particularly when color TV came in. There were so many tubes in those sets that they had to go with smaller tubes, or they just wouldn't.
Or it was going to take up half your room.
Okay, so up next we have the vintage photon. So this is a Soviet-era tube, and there's a couple of generations of this tube. This is the very early first generation, and it's got what we call a foil plate getter, and it's tough to catch on camera. You can sort of see it there, and it's essentially usually a rectangular plate that had the gettering on it, and you can see when it was flashed off, when the tube was manufactured, the gettering ends up down here instead of on top, which is more normal. And we'll look at a Sylvania in just a moment. In fact, the RCA we looked at had a bottom getter as well. And this tube looks very much like an older production tube. And the reason for that is that a lot of Soviet tube manufacturing equipment was supplied by the Western Allies, namely the United States, in the years leading up to the Second World War, to try and get Soviet tube production, to get domestic tube production up to the point where they could supply their own tubes.
Well, they essentially shipped them an entire factory and all the tooling that was needed, and help to get it set up.
I suspect they sent more than one factory, but who knows? Mm-hmm. As a result, post-war tube production looked a lot like early American tube production. So that makes perfect sense. So boxy plates, elevated, that's very much what U.S. production was doing at the time. And this is a great universal tube. It does everything really well. It has very, very good detail. It doesn't perhaps have the refinement of the really premium vintage tubes, but for the money it gets you 90% there. So yeah. It's definitely a bargain. These used to be very common, and now unfortunately they're getting less common. We still have some inventory, thank goodness.
Yeah, you will find lots of the later version with the cup getter on them available for not very much money, but unfortunately we found them to be very unreliable too.
And sonically, nah.
Yeah, not that great.
Yeah, not that great. They work, but if you're watching this channel, just working is not good enough. So this is the second generation Sylvania 6SN7 GTA. So this is the version that was built to the modern spec. Ooh, camera doesn't like that. Right after the Bad Boys. The Bad Boys are the first generation GT, and any GT tube has substantially lower specifications, and we never recommend you use them in any modern equipment because they can get noisy. Now, we actually designed the universal 6 or 12 SN7 kit preamp specifically so that you could play virtually every 6 or 12 SN7 ever made.
From the GT all the way to the GTB.
In fact, right now I have a pair of 12 SN7 Bad Boys loaded into our universal, and they sound amazing. But if there's one thing that we wish the Freya had done, it is to have set up a selectable filament voltage so that you could play a 6-volt tube and a 12-volt tube.
We're seeing that more and more now with amp manufacturers adding in a filament switch, which is fantastic. It's nice to see it happening.
Yeah. Now, we weren't the first to introduce that concept, but I think we popularized it because a lot of manufacturers, since our universal preamp came out, In fact, we have a couple of preamps. We have a phono preamp as well that is also following this universal principle. A lot of manufacturers are now making their filament switchable. Now, in fairness to the designers at Shit, I can't say that with a straight face. They, at the time that they designed the Freya, the vintage tubes were still fairly commonly available, and that has changed so much in the intervening years. So that would be a great thing, a good revision. They could call it, what, the Freya Plus Plus.
Something like that, yeah.
Anyways, this tube with the full chrome dome and the back-to-black straight plates, this is probably, I would say, in the top 3 greatest 6SN7s ever made. It has a lovely amount of warm, rich second harmonics. That's where your warmth comes from, your second harmonics. Second harmonics are not difficult to understand when you think about, let's say you were in one of your favorite concert halls or venues in which the acoustics are just lovely, particularly with acoustic instruments. So, just an unamplified guitar or voice or a small orchestra. Oh, I'm knocking my tubes around here. And the predominant sound after the fundamental, which is how you would view the first sound waves that you hear from a live instrument. After the fundamental, the next harmonic is the second harmonic, and it's it's of all the third, fourth, fifth harmonics. Normally, acoustically in a room or a hall, that's going to be the dominant of the harmonics.
And it's additive to the sound.
It's additive.
It fills in. It adds warmth and depth to it.
Yeah, it gives a sort of a richness to it. And if it's a good recording, and the recording and mastering engineers and the performers were thinking, we really want this recording to have a sense of a live take, it will really help to bring a recording like that completely to life. Anyways, we actually still have a few of these left. They are definitely on the endangered list and will probably go extinct like so many of the great earlier vintage tubes.
It's probably about the earliest tube that we could recommend running in the Freya that would work just fine and sound absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Well, what's up next, Charles?
All right. Well, you mentioned 12-volt filaments before, and this is a great example of what you'd be able to run if you did have a switchable filament on the Freya. And this is a Tungsol 6SN7 GTA. And we used to have sets for the Freya that included Tungsol GTA and GTBs. But they've become almost impossible to find, impossible to match up. We used to have a steady trickle of them coming in, but not anymore.
Yeah, they're essentially extinct. Tungsol was a great manufacturer, and I would put them on par with Sylvania. In fact, the plants weren't that far apart. But the Tungsol never made the same kind of quantities that Sylvania. Sylvania held a lot of military contracts with the U.S. Pentagon, and as a result made huge quantities of tubes. And we're partly focused, I think, on higher production numbers, whereas Tungsol got some of those contracts, but not nearly as many. And unfortunately, you have to be very careful now, especially with the available Tungsols that you'll find being sold today. Many of them are bottom of the barrel cast-offs and tubes that have noise. The
used ones didn't tend to age well, unfortunately, and so that's what you're seeing show up.
Yeah, and that's going to be the same for any vintage tube, that particularly a pole that is used. We have to use rigorous screening to make sure that we weed them out. And some tubes
age much better, and other ones, 3/4 of them get thrown in the garbage.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the great sounding early Tungsols are like that.
Yeah. But this is a 12-volt version, and even though you can't run this in the Freya, you could run it in something that has a switchable filament. So it's a GTA, it's a later version tube. It's got the angle plates that are similar to later Sylvanias, but there's a slight difference to them. They're slightly boxier. And these would be fantastic sounding tubes in anything that had a switchable filament, like our universal 6 or 12 SN7 preamp.
And they're fairly easy to identify. A lot of vintage tubes were rebranded to the point where perhaps half of the entire production of all vintage tubes was rebranded. And so labels help a little bit, but they're not the final arbiter of what, in fact, the tube is, who made it originally. And so identifying features of a known tube from the actual parent manufacturer is what you need to do in some cases. Now, this is branded Tungsol. No, Tungsol basically didn't do a lot of rebranding of other manufacturers' tubes, so we're pretty sure right away it's a Tungsol. But then we can start looking at key features. And here, Tungsol on the 6SN7s had what I call a whole bunch of little dinosaur teeth all the way around it.
The spiky mica on the top and bottom. Well, I think it was not always on both the top and bottom, but they usually had at least one.
Yeah.
And they had these boxy angle plates on the GTA and GTB versions of their tubes.
Yeah, and the box tends to have a really sharp corner, whereas the Sylvania boxy plate tends to be a little bit rounder. So anyways, just be really careful when you're buying tubes. These days, because vintage tubes, quality vintage tubes, have become very expensive, there are a lot of people out there that are selling a lot of junk. And some of it's not even the real thing. Okay, what's up next, Charles? Okay, now for something completely different. As supplies of vintage, quality vintage Loctals 6SN7s started going down to the point where many tubes were becoming extinct or certainly endangered, Charles in particular started looking to see what quality tubes could be adapted to the 6SN7.
Yeah, and I'm not the only one. I mean, Schitt even came out with a short production run of the Freya Plus called the Freya N, or Freya Novel, which is related to the basing of these, that would run these 9-pin equivalent tubes.
And it was a brilliant idea. And we actually have, they probably might still have some inventory. I should have checked to see. But at one point, they were selling them off discounted, and we were getting a lot of orders from customers that had snapped them up at discount prices. And I think it's a shame that they stopped production, because it really was a good avenue or future for people who loved the Freya.
Yeah, well, it just made a lot of sense. It opened it up to running a whole bunch of different tubes, including everything that you see here today. But thankfully, you can actually still run these in the Freya Plus using an adapter. So here is an example of the 9-pin to octal adapter that we sell here. And these are made by Amtata. They're a fairly famous adapter maker.
Yeah, we buy direct from the factory, and the gentleman who runs that operation is very particular. He's got to be the best adapter maker that we've ever come across. So I think all of our adapters are pretty much supplied by him now.
Yep, and they're great quality.
And we sell so many adapters that we almost need to have a company called the Vintage Tube Adapter Company.
We could probably make a good business out of just that, yeah.
Yeah, anyways. And we should mention that you should be very careful about your adapters. It's very easy to buy the wrong adapter for the wrong application. So most people who sell the adapters will make a very clear write-up as to what tube into what socket type that they are adapting for. But it's easy to get confused if you're not familiar with tubes. So just pay very, very close attention. I can remember when we were adapting a tube that Amtata had never adapted before. And I think we had 3 emails in a row in which you said, yes, it's this base, it's this tube.
Yeah.
it's this filament that has to go to these pins.
Trying to make it as clear as possible, because there's different 9-pin tubes that could be adapted here for a 6SN7 roll. I mean, we looked at one, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, the 5687.
Yeah.
Is another option, or a 12AU7 could technically even work with the right adapter, and this is not the right adapter for that tube.
Yeah.
But it is for the majority of them. Though.
Yeah. So caution, if you're not careful, you could produce some magic smoke that would be very expensive magic smoke.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's up first, Charles?
Okay, well, I mean, the obvious thing to look at are the actual 6SN7 9-pin equivalents, which are the 6CG7 and 6FQ7. And we've got two of the most popular examples here. We've got the classic RCA clear top. This one's got the side getter here.
I love the sonics of this tube. It may not be the most refined of the equivalents, but it's got warmth, it's got richness. I listen to a lot of traditional jazz, classical, world jazz, and even some prog, and early electronica as well. And it's just the perfect tube for my genre of music.
Mm-hmm. But we've had somebody raving about this tube recently, and so we've managed to get some more of them in. We'll show another one off in a bit. But this is the Toshiba 6CG7 or 6FQ7, which is just the other number for it that was out there. And we're being told by people there's just something magical about these, and they do sound really good. They have just a great balance between warmth and detail, and it's just something about how the instruments pop with this tube.
Yeah, I think the mid-range pop is one of the things that people talk about. Now, you've got to be careful about making. We've got to be, and reviewers, careful. Don't spin it so fast; you'll make people dizzy. You got to be careful about making sweeping statements, and we're probably as guilty as anybody else because. Tubes will sound different depending on the system that they're being plugged into. Now, generally speaking, a good sounding tube with warmth and good detail in our system, and our system is all custom kit amps that we build and we run because we're, of course, designers, so we're always running and listening to our own gear. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, a tube that sounds good in our system, which is a very short signal path, very
simple circuit,
very, very clean sonics, will sound good in pretty much anybody's gear. And a tube that sounds bad in our system, generally speaking, is going to sound bad in any system. But the nuances of the sonics, those can shift quite a bit. So a tube that we would consider the clear top, for example, the RCA clear top 6CG7, that I consider to be just a wonderful tube in our system for my music tastes, maybe a little bit too warm in somebody else's system. And somebody else might say the Toshiba is just a little bit too detailed with a little bit too much mid-range pop. Yep. So, and that's why we roll tubes, of course, is to find what we really like the very best. So these tubes are electrically exactly the same as the 6SN7?
Yep. So just like how there was the 12AU7, which is a close equivalent that took over most duties, these were the exact equivalent of a 6SN7 in a 9-pin format.
So you've got something that's a close equivalent to the exact equivalent.
Yeah, so this is the 6GU7. We've talked about them lots before. It was a great discovery, and these are really close equivalents to the 6CG7s. They have just slightly different specs.
Same pin out,
and they will work in, well, they've worked in every single circuit that we've put them in that runs a 6SN7, and they should work in any circuit that runs them.
Yeah. Now, in general, the 6CG7, 6FQ7, 6GU7, wow, I must have had a good night's sleep. The difference sonically between them and the Loctals 6SN7 is that they have a cleaner, slightly lower distortion sonic profile. So when you plug in any of the ones in this family, you're going to have a very different sounding preamp.
Yeah, it's going to sound like an entirely different one. And the 6GU7s in particular, I think, bring something different from everybody else. I mean, all of them sound different from a 6SN7, but these also have a bit of a, I think it's an interesting soundstage to it. More open, maybe not more lively. What would be a best way to describe it?
I think it's sort of a better defined soundstage.
Yeah, okay, that's a good way of putting it.
There's room around the instruments and vocals, and it's just unique to the tube type. It may not be everybody's cup of tea, but it's an extraordinary change-up. And, you know, one of the gentlemen that I follow, that I respect, who's an amateur designer, talks a little bit about changing up things. And one of his favorite things to say is that if you're getting tired of the sound of your system, your tube system, and he designs mostly in tubes, just go and get one of your good quality solid state amps and sub it in for a whole week. And then when you switch back a week later, you will be in love with the sound all over again. But you can do that within your existing equipment with your tubes. You can roll in a new pair of tubes that is so different sonically that you'll start paying attention to every song that you love all over again, because it'll give a slightly different presentation. Okay, so now you've got something really different, and we've got to keep moving because we're running out of time.
Yeah, so this is the 6N6P, another 9-pin dual triode. This one was Soviet made by NEVZ.
And it's essentially a tube they invented.
Yeah, it's been called a Soviet super tube before, but it's essentially a 9-pin 6SN7 with probably double the current output, maybe even triple the current output.
In fact, so much plate dissipation capabilities that you could run this as a small power tube.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen examples running one of these to get 1 watt output, but they make excellent cathode followers, they make excellent voltage gain tubes, and a pair of these will run in a Freya Plus with adapters or in a Freya N.
But caution!
Yeah, along with the higher power with these guys comes much higher filament current draw, and that's unfortunately one of the limiting factors with the Freya is that it has a limited 2.4 amps total of filament current. So we've got this handy chart up in the store, and we'll put a link below to it, where it shows you find which pair you want in one stage and which pair you want in the second stage, so like the voltage gain and the cathode follower, and it will tell you if you can run it or not. So since the 6N6P is high current, you can't run it with 6CG7s, you can't run it with 6N6Ps as well, but you can run them with something like a 6DJ8 or a 6N1P.
Yeah. Now, I think we should back up just slightly.
Actually, I just made a mistake. It can't run it with the 6N1P. Too high on the filament current.
Yeah. Okay. And we should just back up in case people aren't really familiar with what the heck a filament is. Tubes run on a couple of voltages. One is high voltage on the plate. 2 is bias voltage that sets the operating point. But 3, the electrons get flowing simply by heating up the cathode. So just think about an electric bar heater or an early incandescent light bulb in which the filament lamps. That would be a better equivalent.
It's the same idea, yeah.
It's the same idea. It literally just produces heat. But those suckers draw current. And the filament power supply windings will have
a limit.
They'll have a limit. And if you exceed the limit,
well, you're going to have problems.
you could have smoke, you could have damage, you could have a fire. You
could have a melted filament transformer, which is never a good thing.
And in most cases, that means that your transformer will need to be replaced. So you have to be very, very careful. You can't make a mistake doing this, because most likely by the time you discovered you've goofed it up, you've done the damage, and there's no fixing it.
Yeah. So that being said, the 6N6P does make an excellent cathode follower tube. It does everything right for a cathode follower. The mixture of amplification factor and current that it can push just means it's perfect for it. Very low plate resistance, and so it has very low output impedance.
And I would say it's sort of the best of all worlds, right? It's a high current tube. It's in a big, tall, sexy bottle. They're built like
like tanks.
Like-
they test exceptionally well.
I was going to say built like Russian tanks, but Russian tanks haven't turned out to be too resilient.
They don't
so-
have as good of a reputation these days.
So built very solidly and a very reliable tube. And sonically, they're the workhorse of that whole general area of well, I guess I goofed that all up. So.
Well, they just sound great. We run them in several of our amps. They're the driver stage and the prototype headphone amp, which we're going to have an update on soon. And there's just nothing bad we can say about them, except they have that high current filament draw that you have to account for.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move along. We've got one more tube to look at here. This is much different from these other guys over here. It's a small bottle, 9-pin dual triode. And this is the 6N1P. I don't know if I can get that label to show up on camera. It's a little...
They're always fairly faint. And this is another Soviet era production tube.
And it's sort of close equivalent to a 6DG8, but not quite. People say that they're a direct equivalent online. Don't believe that. They're not the exact same.
They're actually quite a bit different.
Mm-hmm. And they will work in many of the same circuits, though, including in the Freya, because these were the tubes that were actually provided with the Freya N, or at least not the EV version like this guy, but the standard version of them were provided. And they will work just fine as adapters.
And they're very different sounding too.
Yeah. We actually are hoping to make a preamp that uses this because it just sounds so unique.
Don't give away our secrets. Yeah, it is a very unique sound. It's almost intoxicating when you first hear it. Whether or not it's a sound that will suit your preferences will be a big question. But I really enjoy the sound. It's a very well defined, very open, very clean, very low distortion.
Yep. If we didn't need the current of the 6N6P in the headphone amp, this would be the driver for it. It's just that good of a tube.
Yeah.
And so this will run in adapters just fine in Freya Pluses. It'll run without adapters in Freya Ns. And it's a great tube for that. But this is not a 6SN7 equivalent. It's just going to work in that Freya circuit.
Yeah. So it's a tube you could roll in and see how you like it. Mm-hmm. Luckily, they're not that expensive, and they're still fairly common because there's not a lot of commercial amps that are using them. So we'll put the chart of compatibility below the video so you can link to it. It's also in the store under information.
Yep.
And I think we're going to have to be really fast, but we do have some really interesting tubes that came in. So, okay, well, we've been lucky, and we continue to be lucky in finding some really high demand vintage tubes. And I think last week we showed off some Mullard EL84s that we actually had for a long time, and we discovered we found them in our inventory. Well, Charles found them. Charles is the tube hound, and he said, "Dad, did you know we have these?" And I'm like, "No. Where the heck did we get those?" Anyways, we actually found some more Sylvania black plates and have some more quads in the store. This is sort of the go-to standard quality vintage EL84. Everybody loves the Sylvania black plates. They're not, incredibly expensive. They're not a cheap tube either. And there's still enough of them around that we can make up quads, which is great. But I don't know how long that's going to last. We also found some more of these lovely vintage true Svetlana EL34s, made in St. Petersburg. Careful, there are a lot of copies of this tube that are not the same tube. They're made in a different plant, and they just don't sound the same, and they don't have the same longevity, which is even worse. And you can tell by a few key features. You can see particularly the glue line in here. This is a very old formula, and the spacers are positioned just like this. You see how it's... I got it right on focus here.
On the new, or the fake production, I guess you could say, the bottom spacers and the top spacers are the exact same, but they're different on the old production.
There's some fakes and there's some reissues.
Yeah.
And the reissues I don't know if there's ever been a reissue of quality vintage tube that's anything like the original tube.
No, it's usually just a name.
So, well, it's often the label. So,
Yeah.
and vintage Svetlana's had a lot of different labels. I usually refer to the black label as an old type, but there's been some newer types that had black on them. Some of them have gold and they're gorgeous. Many of them were white and very, chalky. So don't worry about the label on a tube. Always look for the construction. Now, you've made another discovery of a very rare 6SN7.
Yeah, we actually got in just a couple more of these guys in a mixed lot of tubes. Let me get that in focus here. And the last time we showed these off, I think we had one pair, and I believe it sold on the same day. And this is a really rare 6SN7 WGT that was made by Raytheon. And you can tell this is a military spec tube right away. Look at the brown Myconol base. We have the extra tines on here for anti-vibration. And these are just a really, really rare tube. And they have a great sound to them. I wish we could keep a pair around here for ourselves, but we don't hold back any inventory. We have one pair of them in the store.
Well, what we should do for our evening concert is we should plug these in so that we can hear them at least for an hour.
Yeah, enjoy them while they last.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair, I did get to listen to this guy for a bit through the headphone amp. So.
Well, you listen to every single tube pretty much.
Yep.
Yeah.
But it'd be nice to give it some more time.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we've got these in the store. They're really rare, but if you're interested in them, they're there.
Yeah. Okay, well, if you stayed this long, sorry the video probably dragged on a little bit, but there was lots of fun stuff to talk about. There are codes to help you out, and there is a hidden code that actually somebody just grabbed, and they're there for viewers as a small reward, and for returning customers, of course. And we can reach pretty much everyone around the world with flat rate $20 shipping. And if your order is $150 or more, after discount, the shipping's on us, folks. Stay safe. Have fun. This is Jim.
And Charles.
Signing off. Cheers, everyone.